oracles are effectively ways to access real world data. It could be prices. Say if we're talking about exchange rates, I've committed to some smart contract that says, okay, on this date, I want you to submit this trade. And the Oracle could plug in on that date the actual exchange rate, say from pounds to USD or a stablecoin, whatever it is. Or it could pull in weather data or something like this. And it basically enables smart contracts to have a wider repository of data, right? And pull data from external sources that aren't necessarily in the blockchain itself or on the DeFi protocol itself. Welcome to another episode of the Untangling Web3 podcast. So in the last episode, we covered basics of traditional finance or TradFi or centralized finance or CFI, whatever you want to call it. And that sets us up quite nicely to talk about decentralized finance in today's episode. I think one of the most important things that I took from the last episode is there's a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of issues that come about because of these inefficiencies in TradFi. And I think the fundamental philosophy of DeFi is around shifting from centralized entities to technology-driven solutions and shifting trust from these centralized entities to more transparent technology and maybe more predictable technology. But yeah, I guess this episode is to really unpack that.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've covered all the kind of foundational concepts of finance. So some of what we talk about today should make a lot more sense now, because a lot of the stuff in DeFi is trying to replicate some of those financial products and systems in a more efficient way, as you say, or in a slightly less centralized manner where you don't have, I've seen it described as kind of the centralized finance world's like a hub and spoke model where you have your financial institutions in the middle and everyone else is connecting to them. And then in DeFi, we're talking more about a distributed system where you're interacting directly with your peers, your counterparties, rather than having third parties in the middle. But yeah, I think there's lots to cover in DeFi in and of itself. That's why we couldn't do it in the same episode as the TradFi one. So I think maybe let's start with just going through some of the basic key concepts. And I don't think we'll cover everything today. There's so much to talk about, but I think it makes sense to start with smart contracts, right? They're kind of the building block for all these things.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we started this podcast, we actually said, let's do a whole episode just on smart contracts. And we almost certainly will, because they're super important. I think the term is misused in a lot of ways. I know you agree with that, Jack. But yeah, smart contracts at the highest level are effectively self-executing contracts, with the terms in there written in lines of code and distributed across the blockchain network. And quite importantly, that they will execute based on these predetermined conditions. And obviously this creates a degree of transparency in their actual execution.
Yeah, exactly. I don't love the term smart contracts. I know a lot of people don't as well. I tend to try and think of them as kind of like interactive contracts, because they're just contracts. They're not living. They don't have their own agency, but you can interact with them. And a lot of these blockchains like Ethereum or Binance Chain, they are what we call smart contract platforms, where you can put a smart contract on there and then you can interact with it later. And that's kind of the basic model. And then these smart contracts in the DeFi world, they become the foundational building blocks. So if you have a protocol for doing a certain financial product, for doing an exchange or something, then that gets put into the logic, the functions within this smart contract that you can then interact with. You can basically give it some inputs. It will give you an output, that kind of thing. Maybe the inputs is the tokens you're putting in, and then the output is sending tokens to somewhere else. You're getting tokens back out of a different kind, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's very broad, but they are the bedrock of the whole system, really.
Yeah, and the benefit is quite obvious there. There's no need for a third party in the middle, or you're effectively replacing, say, an actual individual or an entity that would facilitate the demand supply kind of trade with a self-executing contract. And that should, in theory, be more efficient, more transparent, and all these things that we keep saying. So that central party, which is classically an entity, maybe has some, procedures that are a bit unknown, complex, hidden, becomes much more transparent by replacing it with a smart contract. And like I said, there's a lot of benefits that come with that, and it's a completely foundational piece in everything DeFi.
And you say, in theory, and you're right, it should be more transparent, more efficient than the centralized finance world. In reality, we'll kind of come on to some of the risks and drawbacks of DeFi later, but that's not always the case. But yeah, in principle, having a single set of rules that's public and transparent that everyone can interact with is at least improving on the opaqueness of the original centralized finance world. There are lots of caveats with it. Like it can be very complex to correctly simulate the same logic you need. There can be big failings, as we've seen. You might write the smart contract incorrectly, and there's been kind of quite a brutal trial and error process for lots of these protocols over the years. So it's not like a magic bullet, and this is completely it's in evolution, right? It's not reached the final stage yet, but you can do some pretty amazing things with them, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you're completely right. Like the idea of being able to, hard code or put everything in life into a binary format represented in a smart contract is quite a difficult one for me to get my head around. Like there's so much complexity in life. How can a smart contract really include every single potential outcome or input? And I find that really hard to actually get my head around. When you talking about like borrowing and loaning, that's quite binary. There's only so many things that can happen. I give you a little bit of money. I expect a little bit more money to be returned the next day. If not, you will pay these fines. But when you start to talk about much bigger things, when you're talking about business logic and talking about how this can be applied to security, derivatives, like trades with 1,000 different people in 1,000 different terms, like that is no longer a simple smart contract. It's much more, it's non-trivial to kind of actually to create that, and to, more importantly, probably enforce that as well.
Yeah, I would probably add to that. What you gain with the transparency of the smart contract is, and again, you said like the complexity of simulating the complex business logic is very difficult. And one of the things you don't get, because it's become blockchain based, you don't necessarily have recourse, right? You can't code into a smart contract, well, how do I resolve a legal dispute? You don't really have that concept so much in smart contracts. It's very much you have this term code is law that people use often to talk about smart contracts. They say whatever's defined in this smart contract, that's how the thing works. Like forget about the legal system, which is a little bit scary. And I don't think I think that's probably a misunderstanding. But for practical purposes, that is kind of how it works right now. If something happens at a smart contract and the smart contract has a bug and it all goes wrong, a lot of the time, then you're going to lose your funds. So that's why it's also quite an experimental, Wild West space at the minute as well, right? You have to be very careful when you research and get involved with a DeFi project.
Yeah, and I think one thing that is hard to get my head around sometimes is how do you get the data into it? Like, say you have these predefined conditions, and I say, I pay back £10,000 on X date, and I know that's actually quite an easy one to prove in DeFi generally. But what about other data? Like, how do I say prove exchange rates? How do I prove that some event has happened that's actually separate to the DeFi protocol? I think that is much more complex, and we'll talk about some of the mechanics for that.
Yeah, and I think just before we kind of move on from the smart contracts, because as I said, we need a whole episode to talk about the specifics of that. I think we will. But some of the terms you will have potentially heard, one of them is ERC20. So this is a standard. And that's one of the good things about smart contracts, is that they have a huge developer community around them already, especially in Ethereum and Binance Smart Chain and other blockchains that exist now. You have big developer communities. Standards have emerged kind of organically over the years for how to create certain types of smart contracts. So if you want to go and create a token protocol, if you want to build a lending protocol on top of Ethereum or one of these other chains, then you have the standards there. So as I said, ERC20 is how you go and build a fungible token, a token that acts more like money. There's also one ERC721 for NFTs, and those are kind of defining what the contracts look like. But there's all these other tools on top as well, things like Open Zeppelin, which is a library for building these. So you can, it takes about 25 seconds to build a token system on Ethereum if you want, right? It's crazy. You can just go and pick a logo, pick a trading name for your token, and then you're away, right? It's quite mature now how you do a lot of these things.
And this is what you're doing in your free time, right? On the weekends, just starting all this stuff up. No, I think you're right. Like one of the big things that we'll talk about as in general benefits of DeFi is that things are open protocol. There are standards that allow you to move from, say, different application to different application. And that's a massive benefit of anyone building on a DeFi protocol, as we've talked about previously, which is the same benefit of Web3. The fact that things aren't closed off means that people can feel much more comfortable creating like this community vibe, building on top of things that are going to be stable in the future. Yeah, I mean, that's really important. I think so. One of the things that we just mentioned to do with smart contracts is how to get data into the smart contract. And this is one that I find particularly interesting. We call these oracles, and oracles are effectively a way to get, well, I guess, data generally from external sources onto, like I'd say, blockchains quite generally, but maybe smart contracts if we're talking specifically about DeFi. So it will have oracles or effectively ways to access real world data. It could be prices. Say if we're talking about exchange rates, I've committed to some smart contract that says, okay, on this date, I want you to submit this trade. And the Oracle could plug in on that date the actual exchange rate, say from pounds to USD or a stablecoin, whatever it is. Or it could pull in weather data or something like this. And it basically enables smart contracts to have a wider repository of data, right? And pull data from external sources that aren't necessarily in the blockchain itself or on the DeFi protocol itself.
Yeah, I can tell you're more enthused by the Oracle side of DeFi than some other parts, maybe because then it gets you into the world of IoT and data feeds coming into the blockchain. And just to kind of add color to what you're saying, right? I think it's worth mentioning when you have these smart contracts, normally they don't really have any awareness of context outside of the rule set that is, say, Ethereum, right? It knows how to validate when you have a transaction happening in Ethereum that's interacting with a smart contract. It can access things about that transaction, but it won't be processed with any knowledge of what score is in the Man United game, right? If you're doing a gambling kind of type use case, it won't know what what massive score Man United lost this week. So the oracles kind of also reintroduce a little bit of trust, which is it's a point of contention, but it provides a way to inject external state data like prices, like general news information, that kind of stuff into the blockchain. And how you can have semi-trust there is you tend to have it signed by many different people, so you're trusting a little bit, but it still distributes that trust amongst many parties. So you might have 5 or 6 different trusted verifiers that all are saying, okay, this was the price of this asset on this date. And that's why you tend to have these oracles exist as oracle networks, right? So Chainlink is the kind of the biggest example of an oracle network where you have lots of different machines that will provide different sources of input data, and then the aggregate of that becomes what you can use in a smart contract.
Yeah, I really like that example you gave around gambling. It's like if I want to bet with you on, say, Man United match or something like that, and you say, okay, I'll bet £10 that Man United win 2-0, for example, and you'll give me some return, like you'll give me £10 back if that is correct. Anything else, then you take my £10 and that's the end of it. Set up a smart contract, very easy to get those conditions, that logic into there. But the only thing that really matters is what the score is at the end of the match, right? And you say the Oracle there is a way to actually get the data from the match, say some trusted source, be it Bet365, I don't know what it is, and pull that data in so that it can execute based on 2 potential outputs. Either Jack wins, takes all the money because it wasn't 2-0, or I win because it was 2-0 and I take the money. And that's a really good use case. I think you are right. The reason I like oracles so much is because it makes things practical and tangible. You can give examples that actually work with people's everyday lives. And I think one thing that you mentioned that's really important is that we're saying things like the blockchain, Bitcoin, these open protocols are battle tested and really trusted. And that's very important. And the more we abstract from these trusted distributed networks like Bitcoin, for example, the more risky they are, right? The less trust we actually have in those systems. And this is a big one for oracles. You have the most battle tested DeFi protocol or smart contract protocol in the world, and then you all of a sudden say, okay, well, it's all dependent on this oracle that takes data from an external source. Well, that is the the chink in the armor right there. Like, do we actually trust this oracle? And that's quite an important thing to understand.
Yeah, exactly. As I would, to use your favorite term, that's kind of where the Web 2.5 comes in, right? When you introduce oracles, you introduce semi-trusted environments for doing, this would be a classic thing, would be if you're not doing a gambling use case or something, would be like an insurance product that depends on, certain temperature in a region for a farmer getting insurance for crops and things. That's a good example I've seen. But yeah, I think it's interesting, but that's, it can be controversial because of the trusted nature. So that's the first 2 big components of what make up DeFi, right? Smart contracts, these things you can interact with to implement logic, and then oracles, which help you add data into that mix and do more interesting things with that logic. The third one that I think we should touch on is actually stablecoins, right? Because a lot of these things, we're talking financial products, but we're talking about Web3, we're talking about things like Ethereum and Binance or whatever. And to get into that ecosystem, you need your money, right? My money in my bank account can't interact with that. And stable coins are, we've covered them in previous episodes, tend to be pegged to the US dollar, for example, have a stable value, but they are Web3 tokens. So they are kind of the fuel that is used a lot of the time to on and offboard into these DeFi protocols. And I just thought it's worth mentioning because in DeFi, there's a huge reliance on them, right? Without the
Oh
liquidity
yeah.
you get from those stable coins, not a lot of this couldn't really happen.
And your main point there is that stablecoins are a means for people to get into, monetary systems that they use every day, like the pound that I can actually buy my grocery with, into DeFi protocols like Tether or whatever it is, because that's what DeFi protocols are built on. It's just an access point, right? That actually allows me to get the benefits of DeFi without actually having to, try and use Tether down the shops or something like this.
Yeah, exactly. It's like if you think of going from the real world and you want to use a DeFi app or protocol, then you don't have to jump into the DeFi world and back out every time. You can convert some assets using an exchange into, say, Tether USD or something like that, a stable coin, and then keep it, going in and out of the Tether between exchanging in between the Tether and whatever the token is you're using for a DeFi app or DeFi protocol. So you don't have to leave the whole ecosystem to kind of keep storing your value somewhere, basically.
And we do have an entire episode about digital cash and CBDCs. So there's a lot more information you can find out on that. But it will be interesting to see if we get more and more usage out of stablecoins and CBDCs, where we care less about the on and off ramping and more about the actual, staying in the system itself. And that'd be quite powerful. So the next big thing is kind of, I guess, a way of actually using these DeFi protocols, and that's around lending and borrowing. And this seems like quite an obvious one. It's effectively a way to use smart contracts, a simple function for earning interest. If I give you, say, I want to borrow £100, I could collateralize some asset that you agree is worth more than £100, but actually doesn't give me the liquidity that I'm actually after. Say if I have a good example of it might be I have a piece of art that's worth £120, but what I really need is the liquidity of £100. So I say, Jack, look at this NFT I have. It's worth £120. You agree to that. It's all covered. I say, I'm going to put this up as collateral. If you'll give me £100, and then you'll say, yep, that's completely fine. If you give me £110 back in a month or 2 months, then everything goes ahead. I'm happy. Fine. If not, I'll take that NFT, and that NFT's ownership will be transferred to me. And that's quite an easy to understand way of actually keeping everything in the Web3 space, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is, this is a very simple use case in DeFi, but it's also one of the original ones, right? So I think as far back as 2015, right, DeFi has been a thing. You had MakerDAO, which was one of the very first protocols, was effectively a small lending and borrowing platform that came about. And one of the interesting things about DeFi lending and borrowing is you have this idea of what's called over collateralization. So normally you might think of, okay, well, if I'm going to take out a loan, then you have to put up some collateral that the bank can take if you default on your payments on your loan, right? Now, because we say this is great because you don't have as much counterparty risk in DeFi because you're just doing it two anonymous entities potentially interacting. But how do you know my credentials for repaying this loan? You don't know my credit history. So it's a good thing that you can access loans and credit effectively without needing a credit score. That's a good point about these things. But for the counterparty, then you have the risk of, will you be able to repay it? And that's why you have this over collateralization. So if I wanted to borrow £100, then normally they'll ask you to put down assets worth about £120 or something, right? So over collateralize, so that you can pay the interest plus the principal amount that you're borrowing if you do default. So this lack of trust actually makes it a little bit more expensive in general for lending and cuts down some of the use cases. So it's one to kind of be aware of, but it may be more limited in scope, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess the point is that it's more efficient because we can interact peer to peer and maybe not have processes like KYC, verification, all this kind of stuff. But the problem with that is if you don't have a central party that runs and mediates everything, is there's no way to have legal recourse. And this has been a big thing for, centralized Web2 legal enforcers and all this kind of stuff, is how can we work on Bitcoin when if I accidentally send 100 grand to someone, or someone doesn't pay back a loan when they were meant to, there's no way for legal recourse. Like, it's a big, powerful thing about Bitcoin is the immutability, right? The finality of Bitcoin. And I completely understand why in that instance you need to say reduce the risk by having more collateral on the line to actually say, okay, this is going to be fine if say you can't pay back the loan in time.
Yeah, and in DeFi, exactly that. The risk reward profile of all of these things we're going to be talking about is generally more extreme than in the TradFi, CFI world. You tend to see higher interest rates. You tend to see, I mean, there's this thing called a flash loan, which is like a loan with a lifespan of like seconds or minutes, which blows my mind. But it's because you have people with higher risk appetites, quite frankly, who want to borrow large amounts of money to do a small arbitrage trade to make a small percentage and then, pay it back with what they've earned on top. So you have a lot of people taking a lot of risk and offering quite high rewards for taking risk. And I think that's why, it's alluring for some people, but when it goes wrong, it goes pretty badly wrong as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So the next big one, which I really think relates to what you've just said, is around decentralized exchanges. Like, this is a big one, hot in the news constantly. So I think this is a hot topic that we will spend a lot more time on in future episodes. But it kind of uses a lot of the principles that we've spoken about already. The point is, rather than me and Jack want to trade some assets, we go through a centralized exchange that make a bit of money on top of that, a bit of commission. We can interact on a peer-to-peer basis through one of these decentralized exchanges, but with a lot less reliance on that. And it takes a much smaller margin, or in theory, it takes a much smaller margin, and effectively just linking us up rather than actually facilitating the trade itself. That sounds great, but some of the issues that have been associated with that is it's effectively unregulated, right? And for example, Uniswap is one of the things we're going to speak about a bit later. There's no KYC required for that in a lot of ways. So I don't need to identify myself if I am to scam people. It's really hard to actually have some recourse to even find out who I am in the real world to even start that process. And again, like we were saying before, there's a trade-off there. Efficiency, but at the cost sometimes of actually having the ability for recourse.
And that's a common theme, right? It's all slightly more accessible. People like to use the term censorship resistant, right? It doesn't really stop you from entering the system, but the risk reward profile is very different. And something about the DEXs, the decentralized exchanges, I find interesting is there are two different types that they've basically been trying to build. So one being what's called an order book DEX, which looks very similar to what the ones we talked about last week in TradFi, like simulating what happens with your normal stock exchanges, stockbrokers. They have an order book matching buyers and sellers. Building that on the blockchain is quite difficult and is not really that popular, to be quite frank, because it involves a lot of the problems you just mentioned, but with additional lack of trust that you don't have in the old world. You have a central party there. The other version, which is again a lot more interesting and where a lot of the innovation has been in DeFi, is what they call AMM DEXs, and getting into this acronym soup now. So AMM standing for automated market maker. And we talked a lot about market making in the last episode. Well, one of the really marquee innovations in DeFi is building these automated market makers. And we'll get into how they work in just a bit, but they're essentially a completely new mechanism to make markets that only really happens via smart contracts right now.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can dive into it right now, because I think, like you say, AMMs or automated market makers are big in the space, and they're effectively, like you say, how a lot of decentralized exchanges work. So my understanding of this, I'd say, is quite shallow, but it's effectively in DeFi, in the whole protocols and things you just talked about, it lets you trade assets without the need for a specific buyer or seller, right?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Okay, and they work using these pools of money, to facilitate trades, and the price of assets in these pools are determined by some formula and not actually by individual sellers or buyers like in traditional systems.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good demonstration of what we talked about with smart contracts. So your automated market maker, the maker is actually your smart contract, right? You build this smart contract that has certain logic in it that defines how, what rules this market maker follows. So when you interact with it, how does it respond to you, basically? And they're all pretty much based around this concept of the liquidity pool, whereby you'll take a smart contract and you say, I want this to be a market maker for a specific trading pair. So you'll say, okay, I want this to be Ethereum to the DAI coin, DAI, which is the maker DAO coin I mentioned. So I want to make a liquidity pool. I want to make a market for trading between Ethereum and DAI coins. Then this liquidity pool effectively gets established and set up with the smart contract. And you put in tokens for Ethereum and you put in tokens for DAI. And the ratio of tokens in that pool is what sets the price. So that when we talked about getting data in and out of the system, the smart contract doesn't need to know a kind of global market price from an exchange like Coinbase. It determines it based on how the level of coins in this pool fluctuates. And as you said, there's a kind of, they have different models, but the most popular one and one of the original ones is called the constant product formula. Have you come across this one, Alec?
No, I haven't, but I guess it's what the ratio of one to the other has to be constant or something like this.
Yeah, basically the number of tokens of one multiplied
Hmm.
by the number of tokens of the other asset, so X times Y, has to be
Yeah.
equal to a constant all the time. So what does that
Okay.
actually mean? If you want to kind of interact with the pool, then any trade you do, because you're basically trading with the pool, right? You have a pool of assets, you
Hmm.
can buy and sell from the pool. And what it does is it will let you buy and sell from the pool of one of the tokens, but in such a way that the change in tokens of both sides is always constant, right? So that just basically means the number of tokens will change. One of them will go up, one of them go down. The product is the same, and then the price is changed based on the ratio change. So that's a little bit too technical for what we normally do, but it's worth looking into. And there are more complex ones, but that's been the model, right? Uniswap was the big marquee one, the first big successful, so I think it's $1 billion now or something. It's huge, but that's what that uses typically.
And I guess what the incentive for people contributing to this liquidity pool, which effectively enables all this, is they take some margin of all the trading fees, right?
Yeah, exactly. They get issued if you contribute funds, you lock funds to one or both sides of that pool, and then you get these liquidity pool tokens, LP tokens, in return, right? And then there's a small fee on every transaction, and then you take a portion of the fees according to how much of the LP tokens you've got. So you can see this gets complicated quite quickly, but yeah, it does work by the looks of things.
Okay, well, that's interesting. I guess that kind of relates to some of the other things we want to mention, like yield farming, for example, which is quite similar to, I guess, staking, which you've just talked about a little bit, which is effectively lending to DeFi protocols like Uniswap, right? And you're automatically using strategies to extract the maximum yields from crypto capital, typically using multiple DeFi protocols at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the farming idea, I mean, it introduces this concept of composability. I think we mentioned it in the TradFi episode, but because you have all these smart contracts that can interact with each other as well, then you can build much more complex systems by making them talk to each other. And then you can do much more complex strategies to extract the most yield, the most money out of the system.
Mm.
And again, it becomes very complex, much riskier when you start doing this, taking out loans to put down collateral to reinsure another product. It becomes very complex very quickly.
And then the next one is staking. I guess I've staked. I think most people have who own crypto assets generally have come across this concept of staking. I think Coinbase first supported it for Ethereum 2.0, right? And this is the idea of
Mhm.
locking up assets, so your Ethereum as collateral, for example, to support a new blockchain. So people would lock up their Ethereum for the new stake Ethereum 2.0 to actually support and be used in that. So that for that one specifically, you'd lock up your Ethereum so that you could eventually contribute to, say, be a validator, which required a certain threshold of Ethereum to actually say you've committed resources to care enough about this blockchain to be able to validate the consensus mechanism going forward.
Yeah, it's this idea of staking is very closely related to locking in a DeFi protocol or providing liquidity to an automated market maker. It's another way of putting in assets and getting rewards for doing so. Staking generally refers to adding assets to help secure a blockchain like Ethereum, whereas the locking and liquidity provision for other things is more about DeFi protocols, kind of on top of Ethereum. But yeah, as you said, I think it's like something like 32 Ethereum you need for it to be a validator. So I don't know if you've got that much hanging around, Alec, if you're one of the validators, but it's quite a
Maybe
lot.
if this podcast goes big, maybe we'll talk about it one day. So I think one of the big ones that people will know about is DAOs, which is decentralized autonomous organizations, right? And this has been quite a controversial one, but it's effectively, you have like stocks in a company. It's similar to owning like a Web2 company, but effectively there's no central coordination. You are distributing this all over the globe, and the amount of, say, I don't know, tokens associated with ownership actually correspond to your input into the company. And it's really difficult. It's actually quite tricky in terms of legality, like how people are held accountable or liable if there's individuals all around the world interact on this peer-to-peer basis, maybe not even knowing the identity of these people, how to hold the company accountable if they say do a rug pull, for example.
Yeah, and we'll come on to rug pulls in a little bit, but DAOs are, yeah, we've also mentioned them before. We mentioned Constitution DAO in last week's episode. They're really like the DeFi equivalent of a TradFi company, right? It's just you can pull resources together to set up this kind of pseudo company structure where your tokens, the number of tokens, percentage of tokens you have is like you're equal to your voting rights. Essentially, it's quite simple. But people seem to like them. I'm not that interested in them personally. I think I'm quite happy with how companies tend to work in the real world. But yeah, I do see the value in the crowdfunding aspect. As we said, Constitution DAO. I think find it hard to see how something like that would happen without this smart contract based crowdfunding.
Okay, so I think we've talked about a lot of the key concepts and related to TradFi as we in our previous episode. Maybe we should just go through some of the history of how DeFi has evolved and some of the leading examples of successful or maybe even unsuccessful DeFi projects. I think this is an interesting one. Most people seem to say that DeFi really started in 2015, but surely it started with Bitcoin. Was that not the first popularized example of a decentralized financial product in some form?
Yeah, this is a really contentious point of debate, actually. I think it depends if you cast the net wide enough for DeFi to mean any kind of financial thing like digital cash, like peer-to-peer cash that Bitcoin was. If you mean anything that involves a distributed system, personally, I think people see DeFi as something that involves a smart contract or an interactive contract, which is why it's associated so much with the birth of Ethereum, right? Because that really became a smart contracting platform. And that's not to say Bitcoin can't do smart contracting or interactive contracts, really, but it wasn't really used in that way for a long time, and a lot of the capabilities were kind of neutered slightly. So I think, yeah, it makes sense why people think of it as being born with Ethereum, I think.
Yeah, and I think when we talked about the origins of blockchain, we mentioned Ethereum as kind of popularizing the term world computer, right? And I think, like you say, there's connotations there of being able to easily input or upload this smart contract or automated execution programs onto a blockchain. So it was really Ethereum that enabled a lot of the DeFi protocols that we talk about today. And when we start to talk about all the projects that are built in it, almost all of them are built on Ethereum right now, mostly because of footfall, first mover, all this kind of stuff. But yeah, it was really Ethereum that started off the DeFi movement.
I think one way you could say is in Ethereum, smart contracts are treated very much like first-class citizens. They're kind of given equal status to user accounts. Let's say they're called externally owned accounts, which I hate the term. But in something like Bitcoin, you have to do a bit more work to make smart contracts kind of easy to use, basically. But yeah, so I think for me, it starts with Ethereum. In my view, the modern understanding, what we're talking about, automated market makers, they're all on Ethereum and similar platforms, right? And then, one of the, as we've said on the pod before, the DAO hack was one of the big first events that happened in DeFi. If we're classing DAOs as part of DeFi, then the 2016 hack was like the first evidence of, okay, this stuff can go wrong, really badly wrong, right?
Yeah, I mean, the point there was that there was vulnerabilities in the smart contract itself, right? And then someone worked these out, some hacker, and was able to actually siphon funds off, and they siphoned was it tens of millions or hundreds of millions? And as we said previously, this led to the split of Ethereum versus Ethereum Classic. Yeah, it's a kind of, I guess Ethereum's the best example, the first example of something that enabled DeFi protocols to really flourish. But there's also some actual examples of how it can go wrong that are quite important, and we'll reference these throughout. So if Ethereum is the first big thing you want to talk about on the history of DeFi, the next one, which is another hot topic, is Uniswap, which started in 2018. We've already talked about it a little bit, but this is effectively a marketplace where you could swap cryptocurrencies for one another in an entirely automated way without requiring any middlemen. And one of the things that we mentioned, which is quite interesting about this, obviously lots of efficiency gains, it enabled cheaper transactions, all this kind of stuff. But a really interesting thing about Uniswap was that there was no KYC, right? You didn't have to upload identity, you didn't have to prove who you were. And this made accountability really tricky and actually quite a hot topic.
Yeah, and Uniswap is interesting, right? Because it's now it's one of the first big users of this AMM model for decentralized exchanges, and it's become huge. It's like something like 2 billion plus in the value of they said the term is TVL, total value locked inside the protocol, right? It's huge, and it's really it's great because the bigger the liquidity pool you have backing a given decentralized exchange, an AMM, is that you have much less kind of price slippage, and the price is much more stable. If a single person wants to transact, then it impacts the price less. It changes that curve on the constant product a little bit less.
Yeah, it seemed quite ambitious and quite beneficial to society. I think the goals really were to, as we say with a lot of these things, was to remove unnecessary intermediaries, but really to also make exchanges more accessible and to remove barriers to people actually using these services and democratizing access. And sometimes that comes to the detriment of, identification and knowing who you're actually interacting with. But it was an extremely interesting, and still is an extremely interesting project.
Yeah, and that was around for kind of a few years before we got to what's now called DeFi summer, right? When these things just exploded. It was in summer of 2020, right? So when everyone was at home, nothing better to do than sit in their bedrooms looking into DeFi finally. That's when the whole market like completely exploded, right? It went from something like 1 billion to 9 billion total value locked in these protocols in just a few months, right? So it had this wave where everyone was, because I'd heard the term since 2018. And then in 2020, it became this, okay, this is a real thing. And it became a kind of household name. That didn't last too long, as we know. But, there's been several kind of high profile crashes. You said rug pulls as well, which we'll get onto. But it's just worth noting that was the height of DeFi. And now it's kind of in a consolidation phase where there's still lots of building, but I think people are struggling to make as much money as they once were on it.
And I do wonder how much COVID actually had to do with the kind of the takeoff of this DeFi summer. I imagine that maybe like traditional or TradFi systems, because of the need for face-to-face interaction and KYC, all this kind of stuff, maybe there was and all of a sudden an understanding that DeFi is the way to go. Or maybe it was, as you said, people just had a lot of time in their hands and they were like, what can I spend that time doing? And I think one of the interesting things about this DeFi summer that you're talking about was because there was this boom of projects out of nowhere jumping onto networks, it actually had a lot of downsides for Ethereum, right? There was a lot of congestion on the network. We say everything is built on Ethereum, a lot of congestion. And this was really one of the first times that people, well, maybe not people, but the general public started to see that Ethereum maybe not be as scalable as it claimed to be. Like, it was actually really expensive to start to use Ethereum day to day and use it for real world applications and all this kind of stuff. And this is what I think this is one of the first times around 2020 was I started to understand about all these kind of other solutions for scaling off chain, side chains, all this kind of stuff, layer 2 solutions, because of the problems that this actually put on Ethereum.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, history repeats. Ethereum had its CryptoKitties moment a number of years before, where this one project got popular and it completely congested the network. Same thing in DeFi summer, it became very, very expensive to transact, and a lot of that efficiency gain we talk about with DeFi, the theoretical efficiency, was kind of wiped away. I think that's probably a nice way to segue onto kind of, well, what's like, let's put the pros and cons out there. What are the benefits and drawbacks of DeFi in general, right? Because we've defined the main components. We know some of the actual protocols themselves in more detail. What are the big, let's start with benefits, right? Let's be positive. What do you see as the big benefits beyond just the fact that it's decentralized? Because some people say that's a benefit, but that doesn't convince me. But yeah, what is it for you?
I think the big one is like the ethical. I think it's an ethical one for me. It's like the inclusivity, the accessibility, like the fact that a lot of these protocols, maybe they I believe in it or don't believe in it, but they kind of go in with the philosophy that open protocols, decentralized financial protocols offer better financial inclusion for individuals and and businesses as well. And like, I know there's to the detriment of you saying you don't need to KYC people, you can't have like full identity attestation for a lot of these things. But there are definitely use cases where I don't necessarily need to know who I'm interacting with. And I think that's a kind of, I think the ethical, for my mind, especially for maybe low order magnitude kind of transactions, smaller transactions, higher frequency transactions. I get the financial inclusion aspect. I don't think you need to KYC everyone for every single transaction. And I think the accessibility is a big one for me for a lot of these.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. It's a much more open, transparent financial system, right? Whether the transparency shows you that it doesn't work is another question. But I agree, like the fact that you can have easier access to some forms of capital. Again, I don't know how much it helps kind of from a financial inclusion perspective with that over collateralization of loans. Like if I want to get a loan, then I need to have more money already to put down as collateral. But I think I agree, like having less friction, right? Less KYC in some cases, and letting people take their own risk is fair. I think there's a market for it. I just think maybe not enough education around people knowing what risks they're taking when they do it. And this idea of censorship resistance, I kind of railed on it a little bit earlier, as in a jokey way, but there is something there. I think the fact that it's a platform and that something like Ethereum is broadly agnostic to who is using it and what you're doing on it, right? The Ethereum network just processes things. I think that's good. It can help people in very extreme circumstances to move money, to gain access to certain assets, to get loans and things like that. I think it definitely has benefits there that are compelling to me.
I think, just to jump on a point that you just said, it kind of, although I'm saying it's more accessible and it's hard to say restrict people from using things like this, you assume technical literacy, right? To actually be able to understand these smart contracts that you're actually, say, giving or receiving loans from. So maybe it works. I think it's not as clear cut as just it makes it more accessible for people. I think there's assumptions you have to make for the people that are using it themselves. Another big one that I know you're going to mention as well is liquidity, right? I think it's a principle of blockchain that we've mentioned previously in assets based on blockchain, NFTs, tokens, all this kind of stuff. It's the idea of making exchange and representing value in a more liquid and easily accessible, tradable way. I think that's a fundamental benefit of a lot of Web3 technologies.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, we said one of the really cool things about automated market makers is that you can quite easily see how much liquidity these assets have based on the pool sizes, and therefore roughly the price stability. So I think that's a really positive thing, and even broader than DeFi, as you said, with tokenization, making very illiquid classically illiquid assets quite more liquid and making it more accessible for people to trade, and even doing derivatives, right? DYDX is kind of does derivatives as a protocol in DeFi. I think, it's interesting that you have these very different ways to access these financial products where normally you would have to go through a lot of hoops. The barrier to entry is very, very high to doing that. And then, liquidity provision being more transparent is good. I don't want to go into the disadvantages yet, but they all kind of have two sides of the coin, right? Because with liquidity, then you talk about, well, lots of the stable coins are mediating a lot of this, and we don't know how liquid the backing is of those, but we'll come back to that one. Composability, I also mentioned earlier, right? I think this is likewise, it's good and bad, because it means you have all these different protocols, these smart contracts that can talk to each other, do different things. You can build very interesting applications with them that give you functionality beyond what you can get potentially with the TradFi world. But this introduces a lot of complexity, and the more complexity, the more risk, the more attack vectors, the more ways it can go wrong are introduced. So, they may be getting higher leverage opportunities from them, but again, treat it with caution is always what I'd say. Is you never know the kind of systemic risk of some of these protocols.
Yeah, and I do relate like composability to interoperability. And it's something we talk a lot about in the context of Web3. If you say Web 1 was super open, anyone could build everything. You had this like extreme, many projects being built simultaneously on Web 1 protocols, like smaller projects. And then Web 2 became much more monopolized, closed gardens, all this kind of stuff. And I think we see that obviously TradFi is a perfect example of walled gardens. There's like 4 terminal chip and pin payment providers in really Europe and America. And I think that's to the detriment of competition. Like monopolies tend to not be good, I would say, in most cases. And the fact that DeFi is interoperable, composable, it allows smaller companies to build up and compete. And also, like you say, the interaction between multiple companies obviously just adds benefit to the users. Users being able to jump between different protocols is a good thing for the users, I'd say.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I like likening it to interoperability, right? That's exactly what it is. And that's why it's good that we have all these standards, because they are almost interoperable from their inception, because they're built using similar standards. So yeah, I think it's good that you can see the protocols and how they work. You can analyze them. It means they're more robust in the long term. One of the other ones that people talk about as an advantage, and I agree with, but with a big caveat again, is that you don't really have a central point of failure in these systems necessarily, because you don't have a single party that can, say, suspend your trading like you have with a typical exchange. But I do still think you can consider the smart contracts themselves a bit like a central point of failure. And you normally have someone who builds a smart contract, even when it's open source. You have someone who can manage it. You potentially sometimes have backdoors, right? And there's been examples of people saying, oh, there's this treasury wallet associated with all the fees collected in this protocol and it's locked forever. And then it turns out it's not locked, that kind of thing. So again, it's a sliding scale between how much of a centralization risk you have with these things. But the fact that it gives you better uptime for these things, the fact that you don't have quite the same level of single party failure risk as traditional finance, I think is quite a good thing.
Yeah, and I think the big one that you mentioned earlier was around reduced counterparty risk. Like you say, DeFi aiming to minimize, the trust needed in counterparties generally, with peer-to-peer interactions, with smart contract enforcing the rules, all this kind of stuff that provides a degree of trust. But like you say, the way you do that, because I don't necessarily have recourse to actually punish you if you don't meet the criteria of our smart contract, is you have to put up much more assets than is actually involved in the deal between you and I. I think that's quite annoying. I understand why you would do that, but it is a big inhibitor for me to actually having this as a benefit. But we're not getting into the downsides right yet now, are we?
Well, maybe we should. I feel like I'm ready to now. I've definitely said all the positives I can. I mean, and to be fair, I think I've said quite a lot of them already, right? Because a lot of these are good and bad, and I've kind of given the downsides away. I think one of the biggest risks is that obviously it is all experimental at the moment, and because we're putting so much reliance in the smart contracts, when there is a problem with them, then as I keep saying, it goes really, really badly wrong, and it's not trivial to just update that. We've seen thousands of hacks and very high profile hacks in the past. You mentioned rug pulls, right? This is when founders of a DeFi project abandon a project and take all the money. There's been examples of this, like a decentralized exchange called Thodex. I think it's about 2 billion in funds taken from that. So it's not small change that's been lost to these protocols. And as with anything, if wherever you introduce the individuals and the companies into this, again, you have risk of bad actors in the space, which is something we have to be aware of.
Yeah, I think a big one as well that we kind of mentioned as a potential benefit of DeFi versus TradFi systems was around the financial crisis, where we said, all this complexity, this lack of transparency, all of that could be potentially solved with DeFi and smart contracts and all this kind of stuff. But the fact is, like, just because I'm putting a smart contract, which is just, automated executable code on a blockchain, doesn't mean anyone's gonna be able to read that. That requires like a high understanding and a technical understanding of the details of that. It doesn't make it more readable just because it's transparent. And I think, like you say, with a lot of these smart contracts, it is very complex and difficult to read. And that's one of the reasons why we have so many bugs, so many hacks, is because even the people that claim to understand them don't always understand them.
Yeah, that's the complexity piece, right? The more bells and whistles you add to this, the more difficult it gets. And one of the other big issues that you've already hinted at is scalability. The fact that when these things were popular in DeFi summer, then the chains underneath them couldn't really handle the demand. And because of that, people are moving to layer 2 scaling solutions and lots of other things like roll-ups, which I'm sure we'll cover at some point. But again, the more layers you add to the system, the more integration and connection points, the more risks you have, the more ways it can go wrong, the less it's understood how they interact, and you have a slightly different security model. So now people are using DeFi, but from layer 2, right, which is kind of a bit mind-boggling. And I'm sure people don't know exactly the risks associated when they start doing things like that, right?
Yeah, and a big thing that I think you told me was around the centralization of these decentralized platforms is that the top 4 decentralized exchanges actually make up 54% of the entire market share. And that's a big problem, right? We're saying that, when we talk about distributed networks and decentralized networks, the point is to have network resilience. But if everyone is coming through, one node provider or one exchange, then it kind of removes the point of having a distributed network, because if that one provider goes down, then everyone's access to this distributed network is gone. So it's no longer resilient to network damages, which is one of the points of blockchain, right?
And actually, one thing we should have mentioned on that, just to extend what you've said, I completely agree, is that in something like a liquidity pool, how do you know that it's not one person with many, many different addresses and many, many different source of funds who could just try and pull it all out? Obviously, there's some protections against that based on how it's set up, but we still don't know necessarily, because of this lack of identity, exactly how it's set up. So
yeah, and I think one more thing, I think this is like maybe a more philosophical thing, is around the idea of the smart contracts and Ethereum. I would say generally people that work on Ethereum think that the entire world, every parameter, every outcome can be coded into a smart contract. And I do have a problem with that. I think that it's possible, and for a lot of things, it should be done because it's efficient. But there's always going to be, it's the unknown unknowns, right? When you and I enter into an agreement, we can't possibly quantify and qualify every single event that could happen related to that agreement, right? And I think this is kind of something that people in the space have to get their head around. You can't code everything up. Not the whole world and every outcome isn't binary. And I think there has to be some means for recourse. Say if you and I enter into an agreement where I give you a loan and based on some parameters, you'll return me 10% on that. If it doesn't happen, you give me collateral. Even if the worst case scenario, you can't pay me back, there should be some mechanism for recourse that if the interaction goes as we say it is with the two outcomes, that's fine. But if not, there's a third party involved that doesn't have to be involved continuously for interactions. Just in case something goes wrong, we can then go to them and have the ability to recourse and to get technical. This is like a 2 of 3 multi-sig or something like this, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, actually. And maybe kind of, because I wanted to close things off by just saying, like, is there anything like future looking that you're really interested in the DeFi space? And one of the things I'm kind of intrigued by is this idea of reputation systems interacting with DeFi protocols, where you can build reputation but pseudonymously, right? So you don't have to disclose your actual identity and KYC information, but you can still build a reputation as a trusted lender or a trusted borrower or something like that. I think that will be really, really interesting. And not to be too meta, there's kind of potentially ways we can do that with maybe even proof of work itself. But I'll leave that thought for another day, probably. I mean, what about you? Is there anything that like really gets you excited for the future of DeFi?
I think it's just all the buzzwords, right? I think like the idea, we was talking about the difficulty with having full KYC process and no KYC process. I think when we start to apply some of the principles and technologies of digital identity, where we kind of meet in the middle, like I potentially upload my digital identity, but don't reveal all my information. I think there's a powerful overlap there. Obviously, the biggest buzzword, AI, like I think of smart contracts and how we can take them from just simple executables to something much more complex. And I think that maybe one amalgamation of that would be smart contracts using AI or AI-based smart contracts to actually kind of start to do things that are a bit more intelligent than just give him the money back, or else you have to pay all this money. Another one would be big players moving into the space, like when we start to see institutional adoption regulation, just to make it more comfortable for people to operate in this. And I think a weird one that I've seen a lot of movement on generally, just to spitball everything, is off-chain computation. Like you say, there's all these scalability issues with Ethereum, and like people are starting to realize that they're not usable for the type of volume of transactions that's actually needed to compete with TradFi. Well, something that's happening now is, rather than having these side chains and layer 2s and layer 3s and all this kind of stuff, is to actually do the computation off-chain and have some kind of verifiable, provable way to link that computation back on chain, or the results of that computation back on chain. And this is a big body of work starting to happen now called verifiable computation. And that'll be quite interesting to see if that can solve some of the scalability issues that we talked about.
Interesting. I think we're getting into some very, very difficult concepts to talk about now. So maybe let's come back to that one in a year and see how far along it is.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I think we've solved DeFi, right? It actually wasn't that bad. I think it was really useful to set the tone with TradFi last week. But yeah, it's a really interesting area. And we're going to have a lot of follow-up conversations, follow-up episodes, and definitely follow-up guests who have much more expertise in this space than Jack or I. But on that, thank you for listening wherever you may be, and join us next time as we untangle a little more of Web3. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3, produced by Emma Camilleri.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media, and be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.